To understand the current tragedy in Ukraine and where this conflict is heading, we must cast aside liberal illusions and look at the world through the prism of realism. In international relations, there is no supreme judge. States live in an anarchic system where the only guarantee of survival is power. What we are observing today is a classic struggle for the balance of power, and the scenario in which the United States and its NATO allies lose influence in the Black Sea region is becoming increasingly tangible. If we analyze the current dynamics, we will see that Russia has moved to a strategy of deep attrition, which logically leads to one of the most ambitious geopolitical goals, cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea and creating a land corridor all the way to Transnistria. From the perspective of realist theory, states behave rationally based on their security interests. Russia views NATO expansion as an existential threat, and its actions in southern Ukraine are aimed at turning what remains of the Ukrainian state into a non-viable rump that can never become an effective military asset for the West. In the middle of 2024, we saw a clear shift in Russian strategy. This is no longer an attempt at a blitzkrieg. It is a methodical, systemic destruction of Ukraine's very ability to function as a modern industrial society and a military force. When you strike the railway junctions of Vinnytsia, Saltomir, and Odessa, slowing down logistics by 40% or 50%, you don't just damage the rails, you destroy the circulatory system of the army. Western analysts often underestimate the importance of logistical attrition. If the bridges across the Dnieper in the region of Kherson and Dnipro are finally taken out of action, cargo delivery times will increase by 2 or 3 times. In the conditions of modern warfare, where reaction speed decides everything, such a delay is fatal. We see how the Russian side is systematically destroying energy infrastructure, substations, and power transmission lines. This leads to the paralysis of repair bases and factories when tanks sent from Germany or artillery from the USA break down, and there is nowhere to fix them. They turn into a pile of scrap metal. Losses in ammunition depots, reaching 30% or 40% of the required level, create a situation where even the most modern Western weapons become useless due to a lack of 155mm shells. This brings us to a critical point. When logistical attrition reaches its limit, the mobility of Ukrainian brigades falls. They can no longer conduct the successful counteroffensives we saw in 2022. Now, the preparation of any maneuver requires twice as much time. While for Russia, conversely, a strategic window of opportunity opens. Accumulated reserves of 150,000 or even 200,000 troops in the southern direction, combined with an overwhelming advantage in artillery of 3-1 in terms of the number of barrels, create conditions for a massive breakthrough. The scenario of a breakthrough to Transnistria is not just a military fantasy. It is a geopolitical necessity for Moscow within the framework of its security logic. If Ukraine loses access to the sea, it ceases to be a subject of international politics in its previous form. Economic collapse will follow immediately. Until 2022, Ukraine exported about 40 million tons of grain a year. The ports of Odessa, Yuzhny, and Chornomorsk provided up to 60% of the country's foreign currency earnings. Without these arteries, the annual budget deficit will grow by $20 or $30 billion. Inflation of 50% or 70% will make the country completely dependent on Western handouts. And Western voters, as we know, tend to get tired of endless funding for losing projects. Danube ports or railways through Poland are only a weak substitute capable of covering no more than 20% or 30% of the necessary traffic. From a military point of view, the creation of a single operational contour from Crimea to Transnistria, stretching 500 kilometers, radically simplifies Russian logistics. The ability to transfer troops in 1 or 2 days without the risk of interception is a huge bonus to operational efficiency. But the most important thing here is the geopolitical pressure on NATO. Transnistria turns from an isolated enclave into a powerful military hub right on the border with Romania. The Russian contingent there could be instantly increased from 1,500 men to 10,000 or 15,000. This will force the US and NATO to redeploy huge resources to the eastern flank, stretching their already limited capabilities. How might such an operation look? A realist understands that Russia will not repeat the mistakes of the past. This will not be a frontal assault on cities, but a war of maneuver. In the first stage, we will see a concentration of forces in the Kherson direction with a numerical advantage of 2. 1. Massive artillery preparation with thousands of shells from MST and Tornado systems will suppress defenses, while Lancets and Iskanders will take out the remnants of air defense. The sky will belong to Russian Su-34s. The use of guided aerial bombs, FAB-500, will destroy any fortifications, allowing an advance of 50 kilometers per day. The second stage is the isolation of major cities. Odessa and Mykolaiv will not be stormed in the style of World War II. They will simply be cut off from supplies by severing the M14 and E58 highways. When a city with a population of 1 million runs out of food in 3 weeks and fuel in 2, capitulation becomes a matter of time. This allows Russia to minimize its losses by 50% and maintain the pace of the Persian offensive. The third stage is a rapid dash along the coast to the borders of Transnistria. 300 kilometers of the path can be covered in 2 or 4 weeks if the enemy's communications are destroyed and his reserves are pinned down in other sectors of the front. So, the loss of Odessa will be for Ukraine not only an economic and military collapse, but also a psychological break. It is the pearl by the sea, part of the national identity. Its fall through isolation and blockade, rather than through a destructive assault, will demonstrate the West's powerlessness to protect its protégés. In Transnistria, there are warehouses in the village of Kobasna, tens of thousands of tons of Soviet ammunition, which will give Russian artillery an additional resource. For Moldova, whose army numbers only 6,000 people, this will mean a complete loss of sovereignty in matters of foreign policy. Ultimately, the implementation of this scenario will lead to the Black Sea turning into a Russian lake. The NATO security architecture, built over decades, will crack. The U.S. will be forced to admit that their policy of dragging Ukraine into their orbit led to the opposite result. Instead of weakening Russia, they got a strength and power controlling a key region. Ukraine's GDP will fall by 15% or 20%, and Europe will face a new wave of refugees and an economic crisis due to rising food prices. We must understand that great powers do not retreat when it comes to their vital interests. The U.S. made a colossal mistake by ignoring Moscow's warnings for 30 years. Now we see the consequences of this stupidity. Southern Ukraine is the key to the outcome of the entire conflict. If Russia punches through this corridor, it solves its tasks for a decade ahead. The West can continue to supply weapons, but without control over logistics and without access to the sea, Ukraine as a capable state will cease to exist. This is a tough but honest analysis of the situation. In international politics, there is no place for sentiment. Here, the logic of power and geography rules. And at the moment, this logic suggests that the map of Eastern Europe will be redrawn in the most decisive manner. Will NATO intervene directly? It is unlikely. Realism tells us that no state will take the risk of nuclear war for the sake of a country that is not part of the alliance, especially if that country has already effectively lost the battle for its economic lungs. The Black Sea ports. We are in a moment of a great geopolitical shift, and the breakthrough to Transnistria is merely the logical conclusion of a process launched decades ago. History teaches us that when the balance of power shifts, the consequences are felt far beyond the battlefield. In this case, they will change the very essence of European security. If we look at the situation more broadly, we will see that the U.S. is now trapped in the trap of its own arrogance. They believe that sanctions and supplies of equipment could stop a power for whom this conflict is a matter of life and death. But Russia's economy turned out to be more resilient, and its military machine capable of adaptation. The transition to the systemic destruction of infrastructure shows that Moscow is playing the long game. It is not in a hurry. It is exhausting the enemy. And when the moment comes for the final blow in the south, Ukraine simply will not have the resources left to repel it. A force ratio of 3:1 is a verdict in any classical military campaign. Thus, we must prepare for the fact that Ukraine will forever lose access to the Black Sea. This will create a completely new reality, where Russia dictates terms throughout the post-Soviet space, and NATO is forced to switch to a deep defense of its own borders, forgetting about expansion to the east. This scenario is the result of cold calculation, and ignoring it means continuing to live in a world of illusions that have already led to this catastrophe. Real analysis requires acknowledging facts. No matter how unpleasant they may be for Washington or Brussels, southern Ukraine is the place where the future of the global balance of power is being decided. And at the moment, the scales are tipping in favor of the one who is ready to go to the end in defense of their interests. Further developments will depend on how quickly the Russian command decides to realize the accumulated potential. But the foundation for this has already been laid. Destroyed substations, blown up bridges, and empty ammunition depots are not just episodes of war. This is the preparation of the ground for a strategic change of the map. When logistical paralysis becomes total, the land corridor to Transnistria will become not a question of if, but a question of when. And at that moment, the world will see a new geopolitical configuration in which U.S. influence in Europe will be finally undermined. We must understand that geopolitics abhors a vacuum, and when one great power demonstrates an inability to protect its interests or the interests of its clients, another inevitably comes to its place. In this context, the fall of Odessa and the arrival of Russian troops at the borders of Moldova will become not just a local success, but a fundamental shift in the distribution of power across the entire European continent. Let's analyze in detail why the Western strategy of containment suffered such a crushing collapse and what consequences this will lead to in the long term. The U.S. and its European allies made a fundamental mistake in assuming that an international order based on rules could replace the hard logic of realism. They thought that by supplying high-tech weapons in limited quantities, they could bleed Russia dry without entering into a direct conflict. But the problem is that Russia is playing a completely different game. For Moscow, this is a war for survival, for the right to have a sphere of influence that it considers necessary for its security. For Washington, this is just another foreign project, one of many in a long list of interventions. In international politics, the winner is the one whose resolve is higher and whose vital interests are closer to the conflict zone. When we talk about creating a land corridor to Transnistria, we must take into account the factor of time. In international relations, time is just as much a resource as oil or tanks. Russia used the last 2 years to put its economy on a war footing, increasing the production of shells by 5 or even 7 times. At the same time, Western democracies faced bureaucratic delays and the reluctance of the population to make economic sacrifices for the sake of a distant country. As a result, we have a situation where the Russian army possesses fire superiority that cannot be compensated for by any smart missiles. In conditions where you can fire 10,000 shells a day against 2,000 from the enemy's side, the outcome is predetermined by the laws of mathematics and physics. This is that very attrition I spoke of. It bears not only a material but also a moral character. Ukrainian society, seeing how their cities are left without light and the economy is rolling into the abyss, will inevitably begin to ask questions about the price of continuing the struggle. Cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea will turn it into what geopoliticians call a dead-end state. Imagine a country that depends entirely on the goodwill of its neighbors to carry out any export or import. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, all of them have their own national interests, which often conflict with Ukrainian ones. We have already seen protests by farmers in Eastern Europe who blocked borders due to cheap Ukrainian grain. If Ukraine loses its ports, its dependence on land routes through Europe will become absolute. This will create a constant source of friction within the European Union. The U.S., being across the ocean, can afford to ignore these problems, but for Europeans, this will become a constant headache and a financial black hole. At some point, the political elite in Berlin and Paris will come to the conclusion that maintaining a non-viable Ukrainian state costs too much and brings no dividends in terms of security. Let's move on to the question of NATO's future. Russia's access to Transnistria will radically change the alliance's defense planning. Romania, which was previously considered a rear zone, will suddenly find itself on the front line. The Danube Delta will become a zone of constant military tension. The U.S. will be forced to deploy additional brigades there, which will further stretch their resources, which are now critically needed in the Asia-Pacific region, to contain China. From the point of view of strategic realism, this is a classic security dilemma. By trying to expand NATO to the east, Washington achieved the result that its own obligations to protect allies became much more burdensome and dangerous. Instead of a stable Europe, we got a region balancing on the brink of a major war, where any spark can lead to uncontrolled escalation. Russia, in turn, having gained control over the entire northern coast of the Black Sea, will restore the status quo that existed since the times of Catherine II. This is not just imperial nostalgia, it is a pragmatic calculation. Control over this territory allows Russia to dominate the eastern Mediterranean and project power to the Middle East and North Africa. The port of Sevastopol, combined with new bases that will inevitably appear in the Odessa region, will create an impregnable fortress. The Black Sea Fleet, which many rush to write off due to attacks by naval drones, will find new life when the threat from the Ukrainian coast is completely eliminated. A realist understands that technological innovations can temporarily change tactics, but geography remains a constant. He who owns the coast owns the sea. Now it is worth discussing the role of China in this drama. For Beijing, the weakening of the US and Europe is a gift. The more resources Washington spends on supporting Kyiv, the less strength it has left to defend Taiwan or strengthen alliances in the South China Sea. Russia and China have created a de facto alliance based on a common interest, undermining American hegemony. Russia's success in southern Ukraine will be a signal to the whole world. The era of unipolarity is over. If the U.S. cannot protect the borders of a country into which they invested hundreds of billions of dollars, then how can other allies rely on them? This will cause a chain reaction in world politics. The states of the global south, from Brazil to India, will increasingly orient themselves toward a multipolar world, where Russia and China act as powerful counterweights to the West. Let's return to the military component of the operation to reach Transnistria. We must understand that modern war is a competition of industrial systems. The Russian defense industry is now working in 3 shifts. The production of Kalibr and Onyx-type missiles allows Moscow to keep any point on the Ukrainian coast under fire control. When the active phase of the offensive on Mykolaiv and Odessa begins, the Ukrainian air defense system, already exhausted by constant attacks, simply will not withstand the density of fire. The U.S. cannot endlessly supply missiles for Patriot systems, because their production is limited and costs millions of dollars per unit. Russia uses much cheaper means to oversaturate defenses. In this asymmetric confrontation, the advantage is on the side of the one who can produce more and cheaper. As soon as the sky over southern Ukraine is finally cleared of Ukrainian aviation and air defense, Russian ground forces will be able to operate with unprecedented freedom. The isolation of Odessa will become a masterpiece of operational art if it is conducted according to classical canons. Instead of getting drawn into bloody street battles that can last for months, the Russian command will most likely apply encirclement tactics. Cutting the railway connecting Odessa with Moldova and western Ukraine will turn the city into an island. A naval blockade, reinforced by submarines and coastal missile systems, will make any supply by water impossible. In conditions of a lack of electricity, water, and heating, the city administration will be forced to negotiate. This is a rational choice to save the city and people's lives at the cost of recognizing the new political reality. From the point of view of realism, this is a much more effective path than the complete destruction of infrastructure, which Russia itself would then have to restore. Many in the West hope that Russia's internal problems will stop this offensive. This is another liberal illusion. The Russian leadership has consolidated society around the idea of national pride and protecting their own. Sanctions, on which such high hopes were placed, did not lead to an economic collapse. On the contrary, they stimulated domestic production and a reorientation to Eastern markets. Russia's GDP continues to grow while European economies are stagnating. This shows that economic pressure as a tool of geopolitics has its limits, especially when it comes to a state with huge resources and a nuclear arsenal. The U.S. underestimated the resilience of the Russian people and the ability of their leadership to make tough decisions in crisis conditions. What will happen to what remains of Ukraine after the loss of the southern regions? It will be a state deprived of the industrial base of Donbass and the agricultural potential of the Black Sea region. The remaining territory will represent an agrarian appendage of Europe, constantly in need of external injections. military potential will be reduced to a minimum, as the country will not have funds for the purchase and maintenance of modern equipment. In such conditions, joining NATO will become legally impossible, as the alliance will not want to accept a member with undefined borders and a ruined economy. Thus, Russia will achieve its main goal of creating a buffer zone between itself and the West. This is a harsh decision, but from Moscow's position, it is the only way to ensure its security in the long term. We must also consider Moldova's reaction. With the appearance of the Russian army on its borders, Chisinau will face a most difficult choice. Promoting a pro-Western course in such conditions will become extremely risky. Most likely, we will see a change in political course to a more neutral one to avoid the fate of Ukraine. Transnistria, in turn, will officially integrate into the Russian economic and defense space, which will finally close the question of Moldova's territorial integrity on Western terms. This is another example of how power on the ground changes the political map faster than any diplomatic agreements in Geneva or Brussels. The U.S. is currently facing its greatest geopolitical defeat since the Vietnam War. Their attempt to expand the zone of influence to the very borders of Russia led to them losing control over a key region. Instead of admitting mistakes and trying to agree on a new security architecture, Washington continues to escalate, supplying ever more long-range weapons. But this only prolongs the agony and increases the number of victims without changing the final result. Realism teaches us that one must be able to admit defeat and retreat in time to save strength for more important battles. But it seems the current American administration lacks this quality. They have become hostages of their own rhetoric about democracy and human rights, forgetting that the balance of power lies at the basis of world politics. The future of Europe will now be determined not in Brussels, but in Moscow and Beijing. If Russia successfully completes the southern campaign, it will become the dominant force in Eurasia. Germany and France, realizing the weakness of the U.S., will begin to look for ways to restore relations with Russia, as their economic prosperity directly depends on cheap energy resources and access to the Russian market. This will lead to the gradual erosion of transatlantic unity. NATO may formally survive, but its real significance will steadily decline. We will see a return to classical European politics of the 19th century, where great powers agree among themselves on spheres of influence, ignoring the opinion of small states. I want to emphasize that the world we live in is extremely harsh and unfair, but ignoring this reality leads to even more catastrophic consequences. The tragedy of Ukraine is a lesson for all who believe that moral principles can replace divisions and artillery batteries. Russia clearly demonstrates that geography and force are still the determining factors of history. The creation of a corridor to Transnistria is not the whim of one man. It is the movement of tectonic plates of geopolitics. And when these plates come into motion, no words or sanctions can stop them. We must be ready for a new reality where the map of Eastern Europe will look completely different, and U.S. influence will be limited to its own hemisphere. The process of degradation of Ukrainian statehood that we are observing is a direct consequence of the attempt to turn the country into an anti-Russian bastion. If you build a house on a foundation that is known not to withstand the load, do not be surprised when the building begins to crumble at the first serious storm. Southern Ukraine is the load-bearing wall of this building. The loss of control over Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa means that the entire structure will collapse inward. The U.S. promised Ukraine security but gave it only an illusion of protection, for which ordinary Ukrainians are now paying. This is a classic example of how a great power uses a small state as a pawn in its global game, and then leaves it to its fate when the costs become too high. Look at the state of Western arsenals. The U.S. and Europe transferred thousands of units of equipment to Ukraine, but this did not lead to a strategic turning point. Why? Because a war of such intensity requires not only quality but also quantity. In a battle of attrition, the winner is the one who has more factories, more workers, and more raw materials. Russia is a resource empire with a powerful industrial core. The West over the last 30 years has deindustrialized, moving production to Asia. Now they have discovered that they cannot produce enough simple artillery shells of 155 mm caliber. This is a shameful fact for those who call themselves the leaders of the free world. Without shells, any Abrams tanks or F-6 planes are just expensive targets. Moreover, we must take into account the factor of human resources. Russia has a population of 145 million people and a huge mobilization potential. Even with losses, which are inevitable in such a conflict, Moscow can afford to continue the operation for years. Ukraine, whose population has shrunk due to migration and losses at the front, is on the verge of a demographic catastrophe. Who will rebuild the country if all the youth have either left or died in the trenches? The loss of access to the sea and adjacent territories will only accelerate this process of depopulation. People will flee from a non-viable state, turning the remnants of Ukraine into a desert. This is the bitter truth that Western politicians prefer not to voice, continuing to make empty promises. Russia's geopolitical calculation also includes control over critical trade routes. By cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea, Moscow takes control of a significant part of the world market for grain and sunflower oil. This gives it a powerful tool of influence on the countries of Africa and the Middle East. When you can decide who will starve and who will not, your diplomatic power increases manifold. The US is used to using the dollar as a weapon, but Russia shows that food and energy are much more fundamental levers of pressure. In the new multipolar world, control over physical resources will be valued higher than control over financial flows. It is also worth paying attention to the internal dynamics in the US itself. As elections approach and internal problems grow, support for Ukraine becomes an increasingly controversial issue. The American taxpayer is starting to ask why we are spending billions of dollars to protect the borders of a foreign country when our own borders are open and infrastructure is crumbling. This internal split is a strategic advantage for Russia. Putin knows that he just needs to hold out longer than the patience of the Western elites lasts, and judging by everything, he is successfully coping with this task. Time is working for Moscow, and every day of delay by the West brings closer the moment when the Russian flag will be raised over Odessa. One should not forget about the naval aspect. As soon as Russia secures land access to Transnistria, it will be able to deploy the newest coastal defense systems like Bastion and S-400 anti-aircraft complexes on this coast. This will create an access denial zone for any NATO ships in the western part of the Black Sea. American aircraft carriers, which are a symbol of US power, will become useless in this enclosed space, as they will be under the constant aim of Russian missiles. Thus, the US will completely lose the ability to project power in this region. This will mean the end of American dominance in the Black Sea basin, which they tried to establish after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Realism teaches us that great powers always strive to secure their flanks. For Russia, the southern flank has historically been the most vulnerable direction for invasions. Control over Novorossiya is a way to close this door forever. From a military point of view, creating such a deep defense makes any attack on the main territory of Russia impossible. The US should have foreseen this back in 2008, when the first warnings were sounded about the inadmissibility of NATO expansion to Georgia and Ukraine. But arrogance blinded them. They believed in the end of history and that Russia would remain a weak and obedient state forever. Today's events are a rude awakening from this dream. It is important to understand that Russia will not stop at what has been achieved if it senses the weakness of the enemy. If the West does not agree to fundamental concessions and does not recognize the new realities, the conflict could spread to other regions. But it is precisely southern Ukraine that is the place where the actual act of capitulation of the old world order will be signed. When Russian tanks link up with a contingent in Transnistria, it will be a visual confirmation that the era of American exceptionalism has come to an end. This will be a moment of truth for the entire Western alliance. They will either have to admit defeat and begin negotiations on the division of spheres of influence, or risk everything in a global war which they will most likely lose. We must look the truth in the eye. Ukraine within its 1,991 borders no longer exists and will never return. This is a fact that must be accepted as a starting point for any future peace process. The faster Western leaders realize this, the fewer senseless victims there will be. Continuing arms supplies only increases destruction, but does not change the trajectory of the conflict. Russia is firmly intent on regaining the status of a great power. and control over the northern Black Sea region is an integral part of this plan. All U.S. attempts to interfere with this process only accelerate their own decline. Think about how this will affect Turkey. Ankara has always been an ambitious player in the region. Russia's strengthening in the Black Sea will force Erdogan to pursue an even more complex multi-vector policy. On one hand, Turkey is a member of NATO, but on the other, it is extremely dependent on Russia for energy and tourism. Russian dominance in the north of the sea will make Turkey more accommodating and force it to distance itself from Washington's aggressive policy. This is another crack in the foundation of Western influence. When one of the key members of NATO starts playing by its own rules, it means that the alliance is losing its cohesion and effectiveness. It is also worth mentioning the psychological impact of this conflict on other countries considering integration into Western structures. Looking at what happened to Ukraine, many governments will think 10 times before making a choice in favor of the U.S. being an ally of America in the modern world is becoming an increasingly dangerous occupation. You get a lot of beautiful words about democracy, but when it comes to a real threat to your security, you are left one-on-one with an enraged neighbor, while your patrons limit themselves to expressing deep concern and supplying old equipment. This is a lesson the world will learn for a decade ahead. The situation in Transnistria deserves separate attention. This enclave has lived for decades in conditions of blockade and uncertainty. Connection with the main territory of Russia will give the region a colossal impulse for development. It will turn from a black hole on the map of Europe into a thriving outpost of Russian power. For the local population, this will be a deliverance from the constant fear of Ukrainian or Moldovan aggression. This confirms once again that in international relations, only real military force can ensure stability and security. All international guarantees and OSCE mediation proved useless when it came to a real conflict of interests. Thus, we see that Russia's strategy in southern Ukraine is deeply thought out and logical. It meets all criteria of national interest and relies on the country's real capabilities. The U.S. acts impulsively, trying to preserve the remnants of its influence without a clear plan and without understanding the long-term consequences. In this clash of wills and resources, the advantage is clearly on Moscow's side. The breakthrough to Transnistria will be the final chord in this chapter of history, marking the beginning of a new era where the rules of the game will be dictated by those who are not afraid to use force to defend their sovereignty. This new world will be much less stable and predictable for the West, but it will be more honest. We will return to the balance of power that held the world back from total destruction for centuries. The irony lies in the fact that it was precisely the aggressive policy of NATO expansion that led to what it feared most: the emergence of a strong, decisive, and hostile Russia on the very borders of Europe. This is a classic example of unintended consequences in international politics. The U.S. wanted to weaken a competitor, but in the end, they created a monster that now threatens their entire system of domination. Now we can only watch how quickly this scenario will be implemented, given the current dynamics at the front, the logistical collapse of Ukraine, and Russia's growing advantage in the air. We can expect decisive events in the next 12 or 18 months. The fall of Odessa will be that point after which there will be no turning back. The world will change forever, and we will have to learn to live in this new environment where borders are determined, not by treaties, but by the front line. This is the harsh truth of realism, and those who ignore it are doomed to defeat.